May we do this for the pure motivation of leading all limitless Mother and Father, sentient beings to Buddhahood. So, some years ago, I was traveling through another city, and a friend of mine who was into Dharma wanted a Dharma talk. But there weren't any other Dharma practitioners in that particular place. It was a small city. And but she had a whole bunch of friends who all walked their dogs together. And she walked her dogs with them too. Mm-hmm. So it was a group of women dog lovers, not interested in Dharma. And so they asked me to give a Dharma talk. You know, what do you say to people
aliens
like that? You know. So what came to me was just to do sort of a generic talk on the spiritual path, what it is, because none of them were familiar with it at all. You know, just starting from scratch, and there might be one or two points that. And I wrote it down on cards before I went there, so that I didn't trust my memory so much. So let's take a look at it and see if you all know what the spiritual path is, right? We all know?
Somewhat.
Well, I think everybody has their own path, right? Their own personal experience of call and, lead up to the call and after the call. So I think everyone has their own personal, but there's some themes in it.
So. The first thing is some people once in a while have a trigger that triggers the spiritual path. For me, it was the death of my father. And that got me contemplating death and the meaning of life, and everything fell into place after that. One of my friends who remembers his past life, he's been in Dharma for quite a few lives, and the trigger for him was he was married, living in a cottage with his dearly beloved wife by a stream, and she died giving birth to their first child, and the child died too. And he went out on the little bridge over the stream and just stared at the running water, and the thought arose, there just has to be something more. It can't be just this. And so he left and became a seeker. And so one teacher said that the trigger is either one major event or a number of smaller events. I saw a time when a man arrived at a teacher, and he was new, and the teacher said indicated he wanted the student to talk, and the student said, well, I don't know why I'm here. He said, in the last year or two, my health failed. I had heart attacks and heart surgery. My business failed. My wife left me. My dog died, and a few more things like that. And I don't know what I'm doing here. And the teacher said, well, congratulations, you are here. And the teacher told him that when it's time for you to awaken, first the universe will tell you silently. And if you don't hear that, it will whisper. And if you don't hear that, it will shout. So the universe was shouting at this man, it's time to wake up. And so those were his triggers. And then he entered the path of Dharma. So, when a suffering event arises, people have a variety of reactions. Many people just try to deal with it as part of life and get on with it. Some people will say, oh, there must be something more, and they will go to the local priest or minister and be given some pat answer, and they will be satisfied with that. And some people will go to the self-help section of a bookstore and find something, or they'll take up some practice of some sort, yoga or meditation or jogging or something. It's quite likely that in an established seeker, they probably did all those things many times in past lives. And eventually they reach a point where they don't want pre-digested knowledge. They don't want pat answers from a book or something that somebody believes. They really want to know. And then probably they enter the path by seeking out false teachers. If you have a false teacher, it's a whole lot less scary, and there's a whole lot less work than if you have a real teacher. And you look puzzled?
I do.
Huh?
No.
No?
I'm just thinking, I'm going to get me one of those.
Well, false teachers are safer, you know. They're not rattling the boat that much. They're telling you things, that false teachers have been probably telling students for centuries or millennia. And so we probably do that a whole bunch of times, and then eventually we don't want that either, you know. And eventually we reach a point where we want the truth for ourselves, and our search is such that we have arrived where we actually rate a genuine teacher, you know. One of my favorite stories is Eli, an enlightened teacher in the lineage of Ramana Maharshi, and before he had realization, he was with his teacher, Papaji, in India, and it was time to go back to the West. And he said, Papaji, do you have any suggestion what I should do when I go back to the West? And Papaji said, teach. And he said, but I don't have any realization. I would just be a false teacher. And Papaji said, Eli, the world is full of false seekers. Every one of them needs a teacher. Teach. And then later on, when he awoke, he had a ready-made band of students.
I thought he was smacking him upside the head.
So sooner or later, our search becomes genuine, and even at that point, depending how recent and how bad the trauma was and so on, we might still settle for enlightenment or the truth as part of a list. You know, we still want to have a meaningful career and a great marriage and a nice family, and you know, number 14 or number 22 is oh yes, and spiritual enlightenment. You know, that doesn't really work. But eventually, as the universe shouts louder and louder, sooner or later it becomes that we want to know the truth for ourselves, and we want to know it now. And there isn't anything else on our list. when I was first with Namgyal in 1967, he one day gave a talk which everyone later called the End of the World talk. And in the 50s and early 60s, there was great fear of nuclear war, and people were building fallout shelters under their backyard and all these things. And so in this talk, not everybody heard the same talk. Some people heard that there was definitely going to be a nuclear war, and it was going to be on Friday. And some heard that it was going to be within a month. And some heard it was going to be within 2 years. And some heard that it was a possibility. That's what I heard, And he then gave detailed accounts of both the continent of Mu, or the land of Mu, whatever that was, and the continent of Atlantis. And in both cases, there were enlightened beings there who foresaw what was going to happen. And in order to preserve the Dharma, they took some students and they went someplace else that was safe. And I believe he said that that's from Atlantis, they went to Alexandria, Egypt, and founded the Great Library there. That was, I could be wrong, but I think he said that was under the guidance of an enlightened teacher from Atlantis. And so he said that that would happen this time, If there was a nuclear war, then the awakened would know about it and would know where to go that's safe. And so immediately his students started forming committees and buying Land Rovers, and they settled on, I think it was Ecuador and the Yukon. And it was based on scientific data on the fallout of radiation that has a very long half-life that will be around for 100 or 200 years or more, and it comes down in rainfall, and so you needed to be somewhere where you could grow your food and so on and have a water supply, but a relatively light rainfall. And the Yukon is technically a desert. It does get snow, but the total rainfall every year is not much. And apparently they found someplace in South America, so they sent out expeditions, But what happened was everyone was forced to sort of reevaluate what they were doing in life. Mm-hmm. And if they had enlightenment as number 14 on their list, was numbers 1 to 13 really all that important, And so it really got people to drop a lot of stuff that wasn't necessary so that the spiritual search could come to the forefront. And then they would finally get it, and one by one they would go to him. There was one guy in university, and so he was going to drop out and study plumbing or something, or carpentry or something that would be useful in the new civilization. And Namgyal said, no, you can stay in university. You just stay and finish your degree, And so little by little the urgency seemed to dissipate just a bit, But it really got people to get to the point, if they weren't already, that the spiritual search really needs to be, if you only have 2 years to live, what do you want to do in those 2 years, And the only thing that has any lasting benefit is make progress in Dharma. Mm-hmm. And so that's what, so that was one way of a teacher getting people to reevaluate their lives and get in line. So the main question that someone should ask themselves is, honestly and truly, what is it that I want? And if you want a good career and a good marriage and a good family and a new car and this and that, well, that's fine. You can do that. But you might consider taking a look at it to see, now you have this precious human life, the Dharma is available, there's enough, even for somebody who works, there's enough leisure time to do some practice and so on. And one should really look honestly at what it is that you want. And if the attachment is so strong to doing something in the world, then you should do it totally and work through that, And but the idea is that one would come to see that we've been doing things in the world for billions of eons. Everything that we do, we've probably done countless times before, and however it works out, it doesn't really have that much lasting benefit, And we have this chance to do the Dharma, we have this chance to awaken. Then you come then you come to the problem of belief. All the Western religions emphasize belief, and the word is used in Buddhism, although it's not really appropriate. In the translation of the Diamond Sutra that I have, Subhudias Buddha, Buddha in the ages of the future, will there be men coming to hear these teachings who will be inspired with belief? And the problem with belief is that it's phony knowledge. I've encountered so many people in my lifetime who have adopted a belief system, and then they actually start to think that they know that. And in obituaries you'll see, I know that Mom is now in heaven with Jesus, and they don't know that. They believe that, And people get very confused about what they know and what they believe. The proper word, in my opinion, in all religions, should be trust. The word is usually, the original word is usually faith, which means belief or trust. And trust works, belief doesn't. As soon as you believe something, you shut your mind off to seeing reality as it is, because you think you already know what it is. If you decide to believe in God, then you're not open to any other possibilities. I had some relatives who became Jehovah's Witness and adopted that particular belief, and I'm not critical of any of these. It's just that my opinion for progress on the path, one needs to be open, and belief gets in the way. Trust, however, I was fortunate enough to meet Namgyal Rinpoche, who had walked the path, and I saw what life was like for him to the best of my perception, and that caused in me great trust in the teaching, because if it worked for him, maybe it would work for me. And really trust, trust in God, trust in Jesus, trust in the Buddha, trust in the Dharma. That works, and it doesn't encumber your mind with false knowledge, and it doesn't shut you down to exploring possibilities as they arise and unfolding as unfoldment happens. But belief does shut that down. You're not open to new things, you're not open to unfolding, because it's already settled. Reality is already settled by what you've chosen to believe. And there are some branches of Christian mysticism where they don't really have any belief. They mention God, but they say, right now we don't know anything about God. Mm-hmm. It's to be discovered, but right now we can't say anything about God because that would just be belief. Mm-hmm. So they're not allowed to say anything about God or have any concept of God until they actually discover God for themselves. Mm-hmm. And then they say, when you discover him from yourself, he's beyond words anyhow. Mm-hmm. So you still have nothing to say. You know? It's just now you know. Before you didn't know, now you know. So in Dharma, even in Buddhism and so on, people slip into belief quite easily, and it makes them feel good. It gives their ego a sense of comfort. The more undefined reality is, the more unknown it is, the more uncomfortable we are. And one strategy for countering that is to believe something. Mm-hmm. And so people will believe the Dharma rather than trust the Dharma. It's a subtle point, you know. Trust works. Belief just gets in the way. It has to be untangled at some point.
Belief is ground under your feet, and trust is not.
Pardon?
Belief is like ground underneath your feet. For some.
And trust is not. That's good.
Yeah. Trust is a little bit more a little bit more. Well, the ground's a little shakier, let's put it that way.
Yeah. Follow me. You won't be allowed to walk on the ground, and you won't be allowed to know what anything is. That would be popular.
Yeah, right.
The next thing is the language of the path. One teacher told me in detail that every great enlightened master at the beginning of a lineage faces a dilemma. Truth is undeclarable. Truth is beyond words and concepts. There's nothing meaningful can be said about it. And yet, they need to use words to communicate. When Tilopa taught Naropa at the beginning of the Karmakaju lineage, he said, Mahamudra is beyond words and symbols, but for you, Naropa, earnest and loyal, must this be said. And then he tries to use words to point at what is beyond words. Do you see what I'm saying? And so the result is that in different parts of the world, people use different words for the same thing. In most Western religions, the word for ultimate reality is God. And in Buddhism, it's Dharmakaya, or mind, or no mind, or emptiness. In Tao, it's Tao. The Tao that can be spoken is not the Tao. The Tao that can be put into words is not the Tao. That's the very first line in Tao Te King. So people use systems, and then they even modify words to get them to mean what they want, or they make up new ones. When the Buddha taught several thousand years before then, there were some great enlightened masters creating what later became Hinduism, and they used the word Atman for ultimate reality, for your what you will be when you awaken. And over the centuries, people came to treat the Atman as a glorified self. You know, I have this self, but that one, you know, my big self, my real self, that will be great. You know, but they're treating it like a self. Mm-hmm. And so when the Buddha taught, he took the word Atman and added a preference, like in English we put un at the beginning of a word to mean not, unnatural. It was an in Sanskrit, so an Atman, non-self, to refer to that, because people had built up concepts over what had originally been a description beyond concepts. And so many years ago, I was married, and my wife had a spiritual interest of some sort, and she didn't know exactly where it lay. And so I had quite a bit of training and teaching in a wide variety of religions and traditions, and so I built up a library from all the traditions of the world that I knew. And our practice was, every day after dinner, we would sit on the couch, and one of us would go and select 3 books at random, and we would sit on the couch, and one of us would open each book and start reading. We'd open it at random and start reading. And so a few things happened. One was that after a while you could feel, in any book you opened, you could feel the longing for something. We would call it the longing for enlightenment, or the longing for truth. You could feel that everybody had that same longing, but they just called it something different, you know. I want to go to heaven, you know. I want to be one with the Tao. I want to get enlightened, you know. The other thing was that you gradually saw that everybody was talking about doing the same thing, just in different words and different concepts. But they were really pretty much all in harmony with each other. If you allowed for the difference in language, the sincerity of people's drive to know the truth was just so obvious and so wonderful and so beautiful. So the big mistake that people on the spiritual path make is that they actually believe the words. You know, the words are there to point to reality. The word is like the finger pointing to reality, and they all become expert on fingers. And they don't bother to look at the reality that is being pointed at. You know, in the first sutra, it says there's suffering, birth is suffering, aging is suffering, and so on. in the Heart Sutra, there says there is no suffering. There is no birth. There is no aging. When people learn Dharma, they very often make the mistake of thinking they know something, and they make the mistake of believing that when they hear the Dharma, they form it into concepts, and then they believe those concepts are real. There's a story in Zen about the clouds part on a stormy night, and suddenly the full moon is there, and the Zen master points at it, and there's some commentary about don't just look at the finger, look at what he's pointing at. In Sufi it says, look at the reality, don't bite my finger. The same thing. So one needs to remind oneself every once in a while that everything that's said in Dharma is just some way to try to get you to see the reality. And there's absolutely no value in the knowledge whatsoever. That's a very hard point for people to take. But you have to learn some Dharma. And one of the great masters wrote this teaching, and he divided the path into 7 gardens. And the first garden was the garden of knowledge. And he said what you have to do is, when you just start out on the path, you go here, see what they're teaching, you go here, see what they're teaching, and when you find one that seems to fit with you, then you need to gather knowledge in that lineage and from that teacher until you know enough to practice. Then you don't need any more knowledge. You need to go practice. And the danger is that if you stay in the garden of knowledge too long, you don't actually know anything. It's just all learned stuff, secondhand knowledge. But people will start to look upon you as a pundit or a learned person, and since you still have ego, that will make you feel good, and then you want to learn even more, and then you don't ever get out of that garden. One needs to get enough to know what to do, and then one needs to do it. And one doesn't need more. The first retreat I did with Tsultrim Rinpoche. He gave teaching every day for twice a day, and he gave a bunch of empowerments on the weekend, I think 2 a day, Saturday and Sunday. And at the end, it felt like to me there was enough stuff here to go and practice and go all the way to enlightenment. And I couldn't wait to get home to practice. And I was sitting somewhere on the grounds of the monastery, and the retreat was over, and I was just waiting for my transportation to go, and I heard 2 other people talking, and they said, oh, so-and-so Rinpoche is going to give a teaching on this over there at some other place. Boy, I'd like to get that, And they wanted to collect more knowledge. And they didn't need more knowledge. At least superficially to my perception, So when you gather knowledge, so-called knowledge, first of all, remember it's not really knowledge. It's just words and concepts about something that can't be expressed in words and concepts. And then also realize that you need to go ahead and do something. You need to gather enough knowledge to practice or pray or whatever it is, and then you need to
Whirl.
practice, whirl, yeah. I set a record in whirling, by the way, when I had training as a dervish
Oh yeah.
at one point. And my record was that I would get the equivalent of seasick or motion sick every time. And it would last for like 3 days after each session.
I went and saw them. I read about them, and they were in Toronto when I was home on holidays. I went and saw the Whirling Dervishes.
Did you? It's a wonderful teaching. You know?
We had a group on Hornby that we used to practice. There was some devotees practicing. So it was fun.
Wow. How much knowledge do you need to whirl? You need some, but not too much. Okay, then you have to deal with the time and the place. If you were alive when the Buddha was alive, you would go and meet him, get teaching from him. You would probably take ordination. You would probably live in the forest, get by with your begging bowl, and you would probably awaken quickly. He did give teaching to lay people as well, but for 2,500 years the emphasis was on the monastic approach to practice. And lay people could get teaching, they could practice, but in Tibet, for example, I was told that during the 1,000 years or more of Buddhism in Tibet, at any one time, 25% of the population were monastics.
Mm-hmm.
That's just a huge percentage, 25%.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened is that in the monastic path, or in walking the path as a monastic, everything is known about the path. The great masters of those paths know everything about it, because so many people did it, so many people succeeded, so many people had this problem or that problem, and so everything is known about it. And a lot of the teaching is based on it. Now, a lot of the great teachers are saying that in the West, most people who want to pursue Buddhism will do so as lay people. Mm-hmm. That, it's very expensive in the West to have a monastery, and and there's monasteries in the States that I was at. What do you do if somebody gets sick? If you don't have medical insurance, it costs a fortune, and even with medical insurance, it can cost a lot. So that requires money, and they probably need liability insurance, which they didn't need in Asia, they have to pay for electricity and food and everything, which an awful lot of that. In Thailand, all the electricity for monasteries was donated by somebody. Mm-hmm. They didn't have to pay for it. And they didn't have to pay for food for the most part. It was all donated. And here, things are just so expensive. I saw a 3-year retreat advertised about 20 years ago, and you needed $27,000 for room and board. Mm-hmm. And you needed to have your own medical insurance in the States, which you had to pay for yourself. And you needed money for your personal needs, and you needed money for your own consecrated Buddha Rupa and all the other things that you would have to buy and so on. That's a lot of money, probably ran up to about 35,000, and this is 20 years ago, So most people are going to try to walk the path in living in the world. And that path is not very defined. There's not a lot of experience with walking the path in the West, living in the world. There's some experience doing it in the East, but in the East it's quite different. If you're a father or a mother in the West, and you compare the responsibility you have to your children to a father or mother in the East, there's no comparison, because in the East, the parents of children will live in a very extended family with their parent, usually with the man's parents or grandparents, and there will be lots of other parent-age people there. So, if you want to take a few weeks off and go meditate, there's lots of people to look after your kids. It's not like here, whereas if one parent goes away for 3 weeks and the other one has to do everything, that can be too much sometimes. So, I gave a retreat once on how to walk the path while living in the world in the West.
How'd it go?
But it's all secret, I can't tell you any of that.
Okay.
But it was really good advice. So, when I say we have to adjust to times and places, right now, if you'd lived in BC 50 years ago or 100 years ago, there wasn't all that much Dharma available. 100 years ago, traveled to Asia to find a teacher, and especially to find some way of communicating with them, because they wouldn't speak English. There really just was no Dharma. When Namgyal came to Canada in '65, there was almost no Dharma anywhere. There was the odd yoga teacher, but now there's things everywhere, and there's books everywhere. There were very few books back then. And so now there are lots of enlightened masters around, lots of teachers available, lots of retreat centers, lots of opportunity to practice. So it's a pretty good time from that point of view. And this is the time we have to deal with. We aren't here 50 years from now. We aren't here 50 years in the past. We're here right now. And so we have to adapt to what's available. I think if I were to take one lesson from that retreat on awakening while living in the world in the West, it would be that you need to find some way to make everything that happens to you all day, every day, without exception, part of the path. And an awful lot of Dharma practitioners in the West go to teachings once in a while, they meditate every day, and then the rest of the time they live their life, and that's not very efficient. One needs to practice mindfulness 24 hours a day, and one needs to find ways to make everything you do, such as driving to work or working, to make that somehow part of the path. And it can be done. Now, walking the path, there are natural laws like gravity. These laws are like gravity. they enforce themselves whether you know about them or not, whether you understand them or not. When I was first in Dharma, I just sort of thought you walked along and you meditated a little bit, and then boom, all of a sudden out of nowhere you were enlightened. And it doesn't quite go like that. There are laws that guide, that run things. And so one of the laws is that what determines the rate with which you progress on the path is the amount of time every day you spend in wholesomeness. If you spend all day every day in wholesomeness, progress is rapid. If you spend 4 or 5 hours meditating and it's wholesome, and then you go out to bars and pick fights and stuff, then it's not so wholesome. So that's a natural law. So one can make choices in daily life. For example, you could read a book that's relatively peaceful, not necessarily really wholesome, or you could watch an action-adventure movie with lots of killing and gore and so on. And so it might be better to read the book, you know. Mm-hmm. It might not be totally wholesome, but at least it's better than some other choices. And so one can gradually think about that. But most Dharma people don't think about that. They lead their lives, and they very often carry on with unwholesome habits a long time after they enter. Another one is that effort moves you, but not necessarily forward. I've met all kinds of people that come and do something for a while, and then they completely change, and they go do some New Age crystal work, and then they do a workshop on opening your heart or whatever, and they keep going from thing to thing. They put effort into it, but it's not really adding up to anything. It's not really, everything they do is good, but it doesn't tend to move them toward awakening very effectively. And the reason is aspiration. The metaphor or whatever that I sometimes use is, it's like you're in the middle of a lake in a rowboat, and if you don't have any clear idea of where you're going, you paddle around in circles, and you can put as much effort as you want, but you don't really get anywhere. Whereas if you have an aspiration, it's like you've spotted something on the shore and you want to go to that. And you start paddling, and if it moves you closer, you keep paddling, but if it's taking you the wrong direction, you make an alteration, and eventually you reach there. And what acts as a rudder and guides your path is aspiration. So in Vajrayana Buddhism, they have all these aspiration prayers. May I attain Buddhahood for the sake of leading all limitless Mother and Father sentient beings to Buddhahood, and there's some that are quite a bit longer, and but it would be like if you if you arrived in Paris and you wanted to go to the Louvre, and your strategy was walk to the end of the block and then turn randomly one direction or another and keep doing that all day, you probably wouldn't get to the Louvre. But if you, or let's say the Eiffel Tower, you can see it in the distance, and you start walking, and then you notice you're walking sideways, and so you correct and you keep going, and eventually you get there. So aspiration is extremely important, and also nobody gets enlightened by accident. Really, you get there by wanting it. You get there by aspiring to do it, over and over and over and over. And so one should consider aspirations very clearly. And you have to be a little careful with them. Like if you say, may I get enlightened soon, it isn't going to work, because you've put in the concept of I, which isn't in accordance with reality. Whereas if you say, may enlightenment happen soon, or happen to me soon, that would probably work, you know. There's just a few things one has to be careful. It's better in the beginning to stick with the aspiration prayers that are already written, and that way they're pretty much flawless. So if you have a burning question, it can function as a driver. Questions that work are, who am I? What about death? Isn't there something more?
Why me? Sorry.
Well, I start every day by saying, why joy? Yeah, you know, one could perhaps contemplate whether there's meaning, or maybe there's something really of significance in life or not. One could perhaps contemplate, where did I come from, where am I going? But who am I? And contemplating death, and surely there must be something more. These are ones proven to work.
Who am I and where did I come from? That one of those two I like.
Who am I and
where did I come from?
Yeah.
I did that at a very young age, and I realized that no matter what they told me, I didn't know. I couldn't. It's not that I didn't trust them. It's just that I couldn't prove it for myself. So I was suspect of.
But you see, that's very, very good.
Yeah. But
If you had accepted one of the predigested answers for who you are, that can kill the whole search, you know.
When you're little, you have, I remember big questions when just a little tiny person, there were all the big questions, and then you sort of get away from all the big questions.
and learn to tie your shoes.
More or less, yeah.
Well, I have much more, but we're running out of time today.
Maybe we could take it up tomorrow.
Yeah, I think there's enough to take it up tomorrow. Do you have any questions or comments so far today?
No, it was a good talk is all. It's good to hear.
Do you believe that, or do you know that?
It felt like a good talk. What really caught me in the beginning of it was in that man you talked about, that fellow that lost his wife and his child in the same day. All those hopes, aspirations just crushed.
Yeah.
And all he's got is running water.
His whole life
which
was
is
crushed, yeah.
But running water is actually kind of a good thing to have around at that point.
Yeah.
I just sorry to hear it, but it was good to hear it too.
The Trungpa had a way of saying, he said imply the truth, talking about instead of telling, so that it's not your truth that's being passed on to somebody else. So it's like it involves the other person. So I think that's how I understand.
Okay. Let's dedicate merit from this and from all sources and times to all beings that each without exception attain the ultimate for themselves.